Welcome back. Thank you guys for staying with us on our discussions on scooters. Let's head right to Ian. Hey, Ian, you're on open line. Can you hear us?
Yes. First, I don't think you can blame this problem on our tourists. And secondly, these are adults that are using these scooters. First, they're choosing not to use helmets, and they're choosing to use the sidewalks to block the handicap accessibilities, and to not follow the rules as are put out when they rent these things. The companies do not care, and it's not going to matter what policies are set out. It's not going to matter what the council chooses to do about it, because the adults are still going to do what they've chosen to do all along. And until they're banned, people will continue to get hurt, and we're going to see more and more head injuries and more serious injuries along the way. And that's all I have to say about it.
So I will mostly agree with that. I think she's exactly right about the behaviors. But the reason the behaviors aren't changing is not because the policy on paper is bad or even that the operators don't care. They might not. It's that there's no penalty for bad behavior, right? You're not seeing either incentives for good behavior or disincentives for bad behavior. You can do whatever the heck you want right now on a scooter. Ride 2-on-1, which I've seen a bunch. Wear a baby Bjorn with a baby in it, which I've seen multiple times, which is crazy to me. Let a child stand on front of it with you, and some of that some of that is probably covered under things that would be moving violations that you could get cited for, and some of it is just flat out irresponsible, but that irresponsibility doesn't change until and unless we can apply the penalties. And that's why I'm curious to follow up on something you mentioned. You talk about the problematic policy. I look at the policy that's on paper and I say, there are some things I would change about this, but on paper, there was a lot of thought that went into it. I give some credit to Councilmember Elrod for putting a lot of work into getting the on-paper version right. The hard part is, I think, putting the policy into practice. I'm interested in if you had real concerns about the actual stuff that had gone into the thinking and the policy.
No, I think there was some deep thinking into that, and I remember I've had a chance to interact with both you and Councilman Elrod, and I think a lot of it is what our city looks like. Our city's infrastructure doesn't have the capacity for these, and that was a concern. And obviously, we want the new shiny thing. My understanding is that Nashville is the number 5 market in the country for scooters, so there is an incentive. The companies care to operate beyond the threat of a ban.
They have an incentive that the rest of Nashville might not.
But there's an incentive too that they give to riders, and I experienced this myself. One of my scooters wasn't working. They gave me a $20 incentive to keep on going. So they want me. They wanted
you to ride the broken scooter.
Well, they want to have a credit so that you'll continue riding and continue having that habit of using it. And I get it. It's smart, but from the standpoint of penalty, that's what I'm concerned about. Because how can you enforce that? I would rather want my police officers enforcing crime as opposed to enforcing scooter violations.
Well, I think there are ways to enforce. Like I have also talked to some of the companies, and I think we just need to be thinking in new ways. One way I heard about is the companies can have an app open and see the people riding around on the scooter on their app. So they could, if the city asked them
shut it down,
they should shut it down or send them a penalty. Or
I would say the city shouldn't have to ask. They should know. At this point, if the scooter companies aren't aware of how obnoxious they are, that's a problem in its own right, right? I mean, they could fix it. I have somebody who talked to me who said they could solve this technologically. I'm like, well, that's great. Why haven't they?
Well, I think it does go back to also the environment in which we're operating and the world in which we live. The reason people obey the rules in cars is because they've been educated, because they're reinforced throughout the society, because there's law enforcement, but mostly it's because people have learned the right way to operate. And so, I don't really think people are any more or less responsible when they get behind a scooter than when they get behind a car, than when they get behind on a bicycle. Someone who is here as a tourist or as a local We're
I
all
don't
the same
know.
type of people, and I think our decisions are made based on the environment in which we operate.
So
what
the
type
one-
of streets we have, what type of laws we have, and what type of general public expectations there are.
I think if you come to Nashville and rent a car, you're more than likely going to be obeying traffic laws, right?
Except we know that most people who drive cars don't obey traffic laws. People speed all the time. Cars are much more of a safety threat than scooters are.
I have seen in 1 month more scooter riders just blast through a red light. I don't see that with cars very
I see
often.
cars speeding all the time though. So I mean, there's
Yeah.
different things we all do when we're driving that are totally illegal and extremely dangerous and very likely to kill people. That maybe that's not what we're doing on a scooter. We're not going to speed, but we might be running through red lights.
You had mentioned the 7 companies, and I remember that Bird at first was committing to just operation through 9 p.m. That has changed.
Oh yeah.
Because I was out, and because they have to compete. There's
Yeah.
a competitive disadvantage if you don't stay open. I don't know how long, whether it's midnight or 24/7. And I'm concerned about you can't see those scooters except for the front. You can't really see them at night. And the issue of inebriation, which obviously that's a car issue as well. So
Right.
point taken on that. but it's that notion is that it's more unsafe because we haven't created a space for them.
Right.
Yeah.
I think, and so there's part of me that wonders, did this arrive in Nashville before we had solved some of the problems? There's the other part that wonders, would we even make an effort to solve some of these problems without a prompt?
Well, I'm wondering, this might be a theory, but they arrived right after the transit referendum loss, and I don't know if there's
Yeah.
any coincidence between that. Whether or not they said, you
I've
guys-
wondered too about the rush through council, where I actually kind of this is one of the rare moments where I had a pretty significant disagreement with Councilmember Elrod about this, because he didn't even want to defer from one meeting to have any kind of public comment whatsoever. He's like, we talked to the departments. I was like, yeah, have you talked to, for instance, the constituents in the districts that are going to be most impacted by this? And we had a well-attended public meeting. We deferred for one meeting, which was basically all we could squeeze out of that whole process. I mean, my personal opinion, I would have been content to wait until this year to get some answers to the question of what happens on greenways, what happens with enforcement, to do this, to wait to see. It's tough because I am generally a fan of innovation. In fact, I think Metro needs to be more innovative in its approach to things, but I'm also, frankly, among the many Nashvillians who are tired of disruptor bros thinking that they and their companies can come in and just ruin quality of life for our ordinary Nashvillians and suffer no consequences from it.
We have Dwayne online too. Dwayne, can you hear us? Do you have a question?
Yes. Appreciate the time. I'll be kind of brief. When I first heard that the scooters is $1 billion a year business, my question is, who owns and who can finance that kind of business? And I'd like to know, does anybody know who the parent company is and basically how the business is structured? And my other question is, when you get on the scooter, you have to read and sign a waiver. Now, does that waiver exempt you if you have an accident, and who's going to be held liable?
These are great questions. I can speak a little bit to this because I've looked at the industry. So venture capital typically will go, and because these are app-derived, similar to ride-sharing companies or short-term rentals, they're kind of considered in the tech ecosystem. I mean, Silicon Valley is just flush with cash looking for that next big sort of unicorn of an idea that could become $1 billion company. There's a spectrum of how they're owned. I think Bird is its own independent company that is scooter only. Lime has done bike and scooter. I think they're still independent. I believe it's Ford has an ownership in Spin. Uber has Jump, I think, and then Lyft has their own brand of scooters, right? So different ownership models. Sometimes they're standalone companies where this is their model and they've raised money specifically to do this. And in that one case of Ford, they're a car major that is invested in it. So it ranges, and they could be publicly traded companies like Ford or still privately held like Bird and Lime. But there's plenty of money from the investor community that circles around Silicon Valley looking for that next big opportunity to cash out. And so there's a massive financial incentive for these companies to chase ridership, to kind of to your point, like not really paying attention to what those hours are when they started, which maybe starts in good faith and becomes slightly less good faith over time. On that On the other point of the accountability, yeah, this is another case where read the fine print carefully, because I have seen some legal analysis that says there are some real risks that the company has effectively absolved itself in most of these cases of any liability associated with injury. So, you know, for anybody who is struck by a motorist, who hits a pedestrian, you know, any kind of scenario like that that results in serious injury, is going to be, right now today, probably very difficult to prosecute when it becomes a real legal issue.
You know, I was startled by the spike in injuries that were going into trauma centers. For example, I think we had 43 in April, and there was an average of 10 or 11 or so between January and March. And I remember that was the NFL draft month, I think, if I remember correctly, so there were a lot more riders, and I've seen folks, you know, we've seen those videos of people just falling down on Broadway, and again, you know, I also like innovation. I like to ride my bike. I like to ride the scooters, but this whole question of riding in a way, unfortunately, we can't. When it comes to competing on the roads, we have a serious infrastructure issue.
Well, that's the place we have done the least innovation, is in our infrastructure delivery, right? I mean, this is a place where we could have spent the past 4 years creating safe access points to the urban core for anybody in a non-car mode, transit users, pedestrians, cyclists, or, you know, anticipating scooters, which we were doing more than a year ago, right? I mean, Lyme, for instance, had reached out early to what was then the Berry administration to get a jump on looking at what policy might work. And we could have spent the entire past year looking at infrastructure delivery and said, like Vanderbilt, where OFO was starting a shared bike pilot, say we're only going to allow this in this area, like a contained part of Nashville, and we're going to build out infrastructure to test the experiment there and see if this works in an area where we have, you know, actually innovative infrastructure in our curb-to-curb space. But we didn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I do think the infrastructure point, though, is a really good one, because we've also been trying for, I mean, the first walk and bike plan, first planning for bikeways was well over a decade, and, you know, we still haven't seen much improvements, especially in our urban core, where we have the most potential for people to bike or to scoot or to get around by other means. And so I really don't have, you know, I think if we wait for the city to catch up, we might be waiting forever. And so having, you know, here we have a great example of people who are clearly demanding better infrastructure, demanding through their actions more ways to get around. And I think the city really is failing to respond to that. I mean, not only did we have a lot of jobs in the last 4 years, we know there's, I think, 40,000 additional jobs coming to downtown in the next, you know, looking ahead to the next 5. And I don't see the city doing anything. And so, I mean, we're cutting transit, we're delaying bike lanes, we're now saying the one mode that is actually successful, that is actually getting ridership, that is, you know, more people are riding scooters at the Music City Star. You know, in my perspective, we should be doing everything we can to make it easier to scoot, particularly for locals. Maybe we should be spreading the scooters to the neighborhoods and not concentrating them downtown, but really looking at how can we make this work, because it's offering a solution that we really don't have other solutions for in our city.
Yeah, I guess the challenge to me is I think I agree in principle, but take scooters away or leave them here, I'm still skeptical that we deliver the infrastructure.
Hold that thought. We have to head to the commercial break, and I know we have about 4 people still on hold. Don't worry, we'll get to your questions right after this.